Well, good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Once again, it's a great privilege to get together with you to hear the story of how the Holy Spirit has awakened someone to a deeper walk with Christ and His church. And our guest tonight is what we call, for want of a better word, a revert, but also a former atheist. So I was reminding our guest that when Mother Angelica wanted this program, one of the motives was because she had received so many letters from Catholics whose children and siblings had left the church. And Mother thought, well, if they could hear these conversion stories of people who'd come back to the church, it would give them hope that if it can happen to this person, it might happen to my daughter or son. And such is the case tonight. Our guest is Sister Theresa Aletheia Noble and FSP. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about that in a moment. Sister Theresa, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to the program. It's good to have you here.
It's good to be here.
As we were talking, I think your dad and I might have known each other a long time ago, back when we crossed paths at Steubenville. So I'll have to connect on that.
Definitely.
So that's great.
Yeah.
But let me back up and let's hear your story, if you would.
Okay. So obviously my father was a theology professor at the University of Steubenville. So I was raised in a Catholic family, and my parents were very intentional about bringing the liturgy of the church into our house. And so we really, people ask me, did you have a vibrant faith when you were younger? And I say, yes, I really did. I believed in God. My mom always tells this story about, I was watching this cartoon where kids would go back in time into the Gospels, and it was a crucifixion scene, and I was probably around, 4 or 5, maybe 6, and the cartoon characters that had gone back in time were really upset that Jesus was dying, and I went up to the television set and I just said, "Don't be sad. He's dying for our sins. He has to die. He's dying for our sins." So I did believe in God, and I had a vibrant personal relationship with Jesus. But I also was...
And you had all the information. In other words, you understood the theology? There you are.
I mean, my dad gave me apologetics classes when I was little. I remember I knew the word heretic by the time I was 7. I was pretty informed about the faith. And
practicing your Catholic faith.
And practicing it.
Gotcha.
But I always was skeptical. In the midst of that, I always had doubts, and I would always be arguing with my parents about different religious questions. And I remember the first time I doubted whether God existed, I was 5 years old, and I was just walking up it's a very vibrant memory. I was just walking up the steps, and I got to the top of the steps of our house, and I thought, what if God doesn't exist? And I remember it wasn't just a intellectual thought. It was like I had this visual memory of everything kind of crumbling around me for a second, and I was just kind of standing in this windy, empty space. And I pushed that thought away because I was really young at that time, and I really couldn't kind of deal with the repercussions of what if God doesn't exist. But I always had those kind of questions. I was the kind of kid who always was thinking about, is this really true? And I would argue with my parents at the dinner table. I remember I had a really difficult time with the fact that Moses couldn't go into the promised land after hitting that rock one too many times. And I remember pounding the table and just being so upset that God would do that to someone who had served him for so long. Yeah. And that kind of was illustrative of my problem with the problem of suffering. I really had a difficulty with the problem of suffering. How could a good God allow suffering? And how could he allow someone who had served him for so long to suffer for so much? And that's really, that combined, my skepticism combined with my problem with the problem of suffering, kind of came to a head when I was around 14. And I was struggling with those two different things. And outside of that, my father had worked in the church, in Steubenville. Then we had moved to Oklahoma, and he had worked in the diocese there. And as anyone who works in the church or knows people who works in the church, you see the best and the worst. And I saw the best and the worst.
Yeah.
And I was young and very impressionable. And I remember thinking to myself, some of these people are really hypocritical. And they don't really live what they say they're living. And I remember having the thought, I want to be a good person. This is my purpose in life, is to be a good person. And some of these people have invested their entire lives into the church, and they're not good, at least from what I'm seeing. And so that, combined with the problem of suffering and my skepticism, made me think, is Catholicism real? Is this true? And does God really exist if he's allowing suffering on top of that? So I do remember the moment I became an atheist. I was sitting in the car and I was wrestling with these problems I had been wrestling with for so long. And it was almost like flipping a switch. I just thought to myself, I don't believe that God exists.
Our guest is Sister Theresa Aletheia Noble. You remind me of a fascinating thing we believe in the church that could even be controversial in some people's eyes, and is this idea that God desires everyone to be saved. And salvation itself is a working of grace. It's not our intellect. Mm-hmm. But God can use a lot of things, but it comes about by grace. And the church believes that everyone who's ever lived has been given sufficient grace. Mm-hmm. So even the person out there, a Native American who never heard of Jesus, that in his conscience, there's sufficient grace to awaken them. And you can see, if somebody's been brought up in an environment, a totally atheist environment, the way God's grace would work at some point in their life is to awaken them to the reality of maybe there's a God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But also, if someone's brought up in a completely religious environment, grace works differently. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's through doubt. Mm-hmm. To strengthen, right. To awaken. Mm-hmm. So you were in the environment of total faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As far as maybe, was there a flaw in that? Well, I bet your parents did everything they possibly could do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But a part of your journey was that work in conscience. Okay, let's see. Let's strengthen that. And that's with doubt.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and I feel very positively about doubt, the role of doubt in the life of faith. But I think in my case, at that moment when I made that decision, I could have gone in different ways with my doubts. I could have continued to walk with my doubt and continued to believe, but I chose not to. Yeah. So I think that was where I made a mistake, but really God worked with that too. So.
Yeah. Well, there's that scripture in 2 Corinthians that says that we're never tempted beyond our ability, but God gives the grace.
Yeah.
That's there. So, you walked away. Now, did you completely 105% walk away, or was there the work of God's grace and let the leash go a little? Well, and here you are. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But anyway, at that point in your life, when the switch went,
it was done.
It was done.
It was done. And I here I am, but it's kind of a exemplative of God's grace, but also I'm a person of extremes. So I do things 150%. So I did atheism 150%.
Wow. Okay.
And it was almost like when I flipped that switch, I snipped the connection that I had with God. And really I didn't feel God's presence. I didn't, I really was done. And
how old were you again at this point? How old
14.
Were you? 14.
Yeah.
All right. Did you? How long did it take you before you told somebody that you had switched?
Right away.
Okay.
Yeah. So I told. I was at the age where I was supposed to be confirmed, and my parents were kind of pushing me to do that, and I said, I don't believe in God, and I don't think it's a good idea for me to do something if I don't believe in it. And so that became a big conversation in my house, of course. And I had a lot of conversations with my parents about it because they were trying to understand, well, where is this coming from? Is this a phase? Is this just going to be very temporary? And I remember at one point saying very clearly to my mom, this is not temporary. I am done. Like, I do not believe in God, but I want to be a good person. That's my goal in life. And doesn't that make you happy, Mom? And I remember,
forgot to ask, children, the siblings, such in your family?
Yeah, I have 3 sisters and a brother, and I'm the oldest.
So you were the oldest? So very interesting. So you've got all these younger siblings looking to you as their model to follow, and you flipped the switch.
Right.
Did it have effect on your siblings at that point?
It did, yeah. And I think that was a big concern of my parents too. So one of the things that we kind of came to an agreement about was my parents said, okay, we're not going to drag you into the church to be confirmed, obviously. We're not going to force you, but you're coming to church with us every Sunday. and I respected that. I respected that they wanted me to do that. And so I tried to set a good example for my siblings in the sense that I didn't want to work against what my parents were trying to raise them in. But I also, obviously, they knew that I was an atheist also, so that influenced how they thought about the faith too.
So, again, our guest is Sister Theresa Aletheia Noble. But you said that you abandoned the foundation for a moral life, but you kept the moral life. Or at least in your convictions, you kept the moral life.
I kept the intention of being a good person at the forefront of my life, and that really was what directed all of my decisions and my actions for the most part. I think that something that my mom said to me that kind of haunted me throughout that time of atheism was when I told her, I want to be a good person, doesn't that make you happy? She said, I just don't know if you're going to know how to be a good person. And I was kind of offended by that. But I truly believed that morality was something that I could discover by reason and I could live by it. And so I tried my best to do that. But I also, I think kind of, because I had thought that Christianity, I had seen hypocritical people in Christianity, I thought to myself, I bet there are aspects of morality that Christians just don't get. and I rejected aspects of Christian morality that I just didn't get. So sexual morality, I don't understand why that would be relevant to an atheist who's just a materialist atheist who doesn't believe in a soul, doesn't believe in any of that. Obviously, I believe in respecting another person and things like that. But marriage, what's the point of waiting until marriage? What even is marriage? So that I just totally rejected wholeheartedly. I also around the same age at 14, one of my friends was a vegetarian. And I remember asking her, why are you a vegetarian? And she said, well, she gave me, the reasons for the environment, it's better for your health, and also for the sake of animals, because they feel pain and I don't want to cause them pain. And I thought to myself, I think that's one thing Christians are missing. And so I decided to become a vegetarian. And so that kind of was one of my major moral focuses into college. I became a vegan in college, and I was the president of the Animal Rights Collective, and I just was very into animal rights. But I also was just focused a lot on how can I be a good person. And so I made other choices in college that were focused on that also.
Would you have seen yourself as thinking that as now an atheist you had come to a higher plane? You know what I mean, in terms of a higher plane of understanding life, so that you had I don't mean to automatically convey a negative, but a superior way of understanding morality and able to cut through the stuff.
Yeah, I did think that in some sense, rejecting Christianity gave me kind of a leg up. on understanding what would be best, morally speaking.
Now you could, in fact, now you're at the place in that thinking that you've recognized that humans and animals are the same.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not so much that you've denigrated humanity down to the animal life, but you brought animal life up to an equivalent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So if you had to decide between saving a little baby in a pool versus a young, beautiful Doberman Pinscher in the pool, you would have had a moral dilemma.
Yeah, and in fact, in college, I studied political philosophy, but my boyfriend studied philosophy, so we had a lot of philosophical conversations. And he was a vegan also. We were both very involved in animal rights. But we had a little bit of a difference in terms of how we viewed it. And we both would argue about that. Basically, we would say, if there's a child in front of you and a dog, and you had to shoot one, which would you shoot? Yeah. And I would always say the dog, and he would say, it doesn't matter. Because in terms of speciesism, you're basically kind of siding with your species, but for an arbitrary reason, really. And this is kind of a philosophical argument that comes from Peter Singer. And I always had a difficulty with that, but I couldn't really, we would go over it and over it and over it, but I couldn't really support my philosophical reasons for believing that human life was more valuable than animal life. Because really for animal rights activists, a lot of it comes down to sentience. We both are capable of feeling pain. Animals are capable of feeling pain. So really, that's what we should care about in terms of what makes animal life equal. When you factor in intelligence, then that complicates things, because a baby, for instance, is less intelligent than a pig. A pig can do, math that a 3-year-old can't do. So really, it creates these moral conundrums that animal rights activists say kind of complicate it. So really, it should just come down to, do you feel pain? And that's what makes life valuable.
I love the way the Lord works sometimes. Last night, I happened to be watching an old movie called The Devil and Daniel Webster. And it's a movie of an old short story by Benet. But in the story, the man sells his soul to the devil for 2 cents. And what happens is the devil convinces him first that the soul doesn't matter. It's not worth anything. In other words, so if it isn't worth anything, well, then why not sell the soul to the devil? Mm-hmm. Where were you with the soul? If you got animals and human beings, right. If its feeling makes them similar, intelligence makes it complicated, is there a soul left for you at the time?
I was a materialist atheist, so no. So I didn't believe in a soul, but that's what gave me trouble philosophically, because I kept, in college, I just kept running over this problem over and over and over again, and I could not think of anything else that could explain it besides the soul, because it's not just intelligence. There's something, Augustine talks about levels of the soul, and sentience is like the second level. It goes to 7 levels, and the 7th is like the beatific vision and contemplation of truth, and all of these things that are inherently religious. And so I couldn't think of how a materialist could believe in a soul, but I had this deep sense that there was something that made human life more valuable than animal life, but I couldn't defend it philosophically. And I remember I went to see Peter Singer speak at one point, and he was actually talking about his many people know that he believes that we should kill disabled babies because their life, we shouldn't make them go through life like that. And I remember sitting there listening to him speak, and I just got goosebumps. I just felt this deep sense of, that's evil. And I really, philosophically, I knew that human life was more valuable, but I was involved in this movement where people had differing views, but the majority of people believed that animal life and human life is equal. And in some sense, some were even more radical than that. They believed that because humans cause so much damage to the environment, it would be better if they were just completely wiped off the face of the earth.
That whole movement Right, sees humankind as the worst disease that ever hit the earth.
Yeah.
And on the one hand, they've got an argument because we have done some pretty nasty things with this world. Partially when we thought we had the right to subdue it, even by the words of Scripture, that it's our responsibility to subdue it, and then we ended up using it for our benefit, for commercial gain. So there's a truth there. But as Christians, we believe that, on the other hand, humanity is the peak of creation, and that's the reason the world was created, was for our benefit. Now we're to treat it in the image of God. We didn't often do that. Before we take a break, though, I had one other question. How did your dad feel about all this? The reason I say that is here he is, a theologian. He gets up in class and teaches theology, and his number one daughter has rejected it all. I would have thought that would have been tough.
It was very devastating for both of my parents. And I think, especially in high school, my behavior was really off the charts bad. I was just sex, drugs, rock and roll. In my case, it was punk rock. I was sneaking out of the house. I was doing all kinds of crazy stuff. But at the same time, I was maintaining high grades, and I was doing... So my parents weren't totally aware of what was happening. But I think they could see spiritually what was happening. And I remember coming home from something really late, and I know I smelled like cigarettes, and I'd been drinking, and my dad hugged me, and I knew that he could smell the cigarettes, and he knew what was happening. And he didn't say anything to me, but I remember the look on his face was just this deep concern for what was going on with me. Because I think on top of all of the intellectual things that was happening, I had a lot of anger against the church and against, people who I felt had done my family wrong, who had done wrong in general. And there was a lot of suffering going on in my family also. So I was angry about the problem of suffering. And since I didn't have God to be angry about it at anymore, I was just an angry person. So my parents were very concerned for me.
I've jokingly said that the reason the Catholic Church made priests celibate is so they didn't have to worry about PKs, the real pain of children that completely reject everything that they stand for. And married pastors who get up there in the pulpit every Sunday, and then there's their kids, or maybe they're not there because they rejected it. I mean, it's not about, why have you done this to me? It's more about, Lord, what have I done wrong?
Yeah.
What have I done wrong?
Yeah.
And does this make who am I to be up here preaching?
Yeah.
In my own family. So I'm sure they both, remember those times for you. Were you oblivious to that at the time, you think? Or it didn't matter? I mean,
I knew that I was causing them great suffering, but I also was, I was in love with the truth, and
yep, you're on that plane that you had risen to.
To me, that was the truth, and I couldn't reject the truth just because it was causing someone suffering. So I hated that I was causing them suffering. I wish that I couldn't, that I could do something that would relieve it, but I also knew that what they wanted me to do to relieve it was just impossible for me. So
some atheists feel a calling to evangelize. In other words, you've by grace, you want to put it that way, been at a new plane. Did you feel that really what you needed to do was to help them themselves break free from this junk so that they could have the freedom? Did you feel a sense of that?
I didn't. I wasn't an evangelist in terms of atheism. I really just didn't see the point, because I thought to myself, if people are happier believing something that's not true, let them be happy. They're just going to die anyways, and it's going to be the end, and they might as well be happier with their beliefs. So I really didn't get in arguments unless it was with other people who were with me seeking the truth. And in that sense, if people were open to discussing with me things, then I would be really happy to tell them that I thought they were wrong. But if they didn't really want to discuss it with me, then I would let them live and let live.
Opiate of the masses, whatever got them through the night.
Yeah.
Whatever can keep them controlled, then that's fine. Whatever.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's take a break. Okay, we'll come back and figure out how you got out of that by grace. We'll find out. But before we take a break, I just want to remind you a couple things, or tell you that Sister Theresa's written conversion story called A Story of Hope is published at our website. It's called, if you go to chnetwork.org, you'll be able to read her whole story, but also on our website, she has a couple of short videos. We call them insight videos. You'll see them on the website. And I think one of those is about, you discuss death, right? We'll talk about that in the second half.
Okay.
I think that, to me, I was thinking, as an atheist, the difference between a human and a being, and you stand before somebody who's in a coffin. It's got to awaken to you to something.
Definitely.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that in a moment. All right, see you in a bit. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our guest is Sister Theresa Aletheia Noble. And as I so rudely interrupted you in your story, you just left us with the fact that you were out there with drugs and smoking and all this stuff, and there you were. So what was the trajectory of that?
So, after high school, I was really involved in the punk rock movement and sneaking out and doing all these things that were very concerning to my parents. Yeah. But I also was managing to keep my grades high. And so it was kind of a saving grace that at the end of high school, I got into a good college. And at that point, I knew that I needed to kind of drop some of these dangerous activities. I mean, I had seen friends die and overdose, and it was, I knew that if I continued in that line, because I'm a kind of a person of 150%, I could really die. So I decided I was just going to leave those things behind, but I was going to really focus on being a good person and going to a good college as part of that. And this was my plan now. And so in college, I started studying philosophy, and it was interesting to me because I remember having this realization at one point that all the philosophers I was studying were theists. Except for obviously like Nietzsche, but even he took Christianity so seriously that he would write huge diatribes against Christianity, and I had kind of just totally dismissed it. So I thought to myself, that's interesting, and I started to wrestle even more with the idea of whether the animals, whether humans have a soul. And I remember in college, I was so into animal rights that my parents were trying to they were trying to connect with me and relate to me and understand where I was coming from. But they also were trying to see, like, what's an end to this worldview? And one of them was they sent me this I think it was like a news thing that vegetarians had picked up on, that JP2, John Paul II, who was Pope at the time, had said that animals have souls, which is, that's just a very basic philosophical thing, but it was news to them that Catholics think animals have souls. And I remember they sent the news article to me, and I thought, what does that mean exactly to a Catholic? And I thought to myself, what does it mean that an animal would have a soul? So I remember doing a little bit of research into what Catholics think about souls and humans having souls and the difference between them. And obviously I rejected the idea that humans have an immortal soul and there's something different about the human soul than animal souls. But it got me thinking that there are these, I just thought to myself, I reject that, but I believe it somehow, because I do believe that there is a difference. And in terms of materialism, it's giving me no answers in terms of what that difference could possibly be. So I could just continue to wrestle with it. After college, I got into Teach for America, and I was teaching in an inner city school. That was kind of also in my plan of being a good person. I was going to do this kind of self-sacrificing, very difficult thing. And I did that for 2 years. It was a very difficult experience. And I remember for the first time in my life, I was doing something where I felt like I wasn't totally capable of doing it. And how I was not quite a good person got, exemplified almost every day when I would get irritated at my students, and I would yell at my students, and I would go home and think, I need to be a good person for these kids. Like I had this very motherly instinct that they had such difficult home lives. They went home to such difficult things. And it was so important for me to teach them how to read. I was teaching 3rd grade and all my students didn't know how to read. And I really felt invested in being a good person for them. But I also at the same time was really seeing how in many ways I was just really not a good person. And so I thought, maybe, okay, what do people do when they're trying to be good people and they don't have the tools to do it? And so I turned to meditation, which is what a lot of people, do when they're thinking something non-religious, but it's going to help me be more focused.
Not about connecting to a source, but getting yourself in order.
Focused and peaceful. But I found it incredibly boring, and I was very bad at it. I remember I would wake up early, and I would sit in the corner and do my little meditation. And I remember thinking to myself, this is so boring. How do people do this? And I would fall over asleep and just wake up and just like, I also started going to Quaker meeting. Because I had gone to a school that was associated with other Quaker colleges, and I was introduced to Quakerism at the time, and I related to the social justice aspect of it. Obviously, I didn't relate to any of the Christian aspects of it, but the Quaker meeting that I was at was very intellectual and very, some of them I'm pretty sure were agnostic, and so I could relate to the people. It was kind of this way to start off my week in complete silence, and people would say very nice things, and I have a spiritual theme for the week, but it wasn't really spiritual. I made it very clear to myself, I still don't believe in God. I still don't, and my atheist boyfriend went with me, so we still weren't believing in the existence of God, but it was kind of giving this grounding for facing the difficulties that I was facing at the time of my life. And during that time, one of my friends, we had been very close throughout high school and college, and he had been climbing a mountain, and as he was reaching for a cornice, it broke, and he fell over like about 3,000 feet to the ground, and he died.
Wow.
And at that moment, when I found out about his death, I remember thinking to myself, this question of whether humans have a soul is really urgent to me right now, because I want to know, is there something more to my friend? And every time I tell this story, I can hear the atheist in me be like, well, that was very an emotional kind of need to believe in a soul. But I remember thinking to myself, I want to know what is true. It's not about what is more comforting. It is about what is true. And if the truth is that my friend is in a hole and his body is rotting and that is the end, I want to know. So I just decided to put more effort into understanding whether there was a spiritual dimension to life. And it wasn't that I was necessarily open to it. It was that I was opening myself to the possibility. I was finally saying, okay, I'm not finding answers in materialism, so I'm going to open myself to these other possibilities, not because I necessarily believe I'm going to find answers, but because I feel like it's incumbent upon me as an atheist to have really explored all of the possibilities.
I was thinking that not only in your life had you checked the box that there's no God, there's no soul, there's also no devil. Mm-hmm. There's no whisperer.
Yeah.
There's no somebody trying to pull you away. There's no somebody trying, all that wasn't also.
Yeah.
So if anything, you were a victim to those.
Absolutely.
Influences all those times.
And I have to say, looking back on my behavior and the things that I did and the things that I fell into, I think that's the biggest pitfall, is to realize that it's really difficult to objectively discover what is true when we have concupiscence, but also combined with the devil just wanting to lead you to the wrong. And he does it so slyly and so subtly that even the most intelligent people just have no idea that they're being manipulated, really. Yeah. And manipulated to a place of very deep despair, because that's where he wants to lead us. Wow. And that's where I went.
But grace had touched you, though, to at least with that unfortunate death of your friend, to say, wait, I've got to deal with this. Mm-hmm. And that was the point. So then what you discovered then in the dealing with that? Where'd you begin to deal with that?
Well, so the 2 years that I was teaching in an inner city in Miami, I was just kind of hanging on for my life. And I was meditating, but I didn't have so much time to really investigate those things. Then I decided I was going to take a year off, and then I was going to go to law school. So and my boyfriend at the time had gotten into a PhD program at Stanford for philosophy. And so I followed him there, and I was just living there. And all of a sudden I went from this incredibly busy life to absolutely nothing to do. And it gave me a lot of time to think about all of these things, but it also, I was wrestling with it intellectually, and I was reading all kinds of things, but I was feeling despairing because I couldn't find any answers. And I remember one moment where I was sitting under a tree, I was by myself, and I was looking around, and I was like, is this life even real? What is life? What is the meaning of my life? And am I going in the right direction? And is law school going to make me happy? And is marrying this person going to make me happy? And I was kind of planning out the trajectory of my life, and it just felt so empty. And I remember kind of putting my hand against the tree trunk and rubbing it, like just to feel pain, because I was thinking it was almost like I needed to exteriorize what I was feeling inside. It was so painful. I felt so despairing and empty, and I just didn't know where to find answers. And I felt like I was kind of running up against the limits of my own intellect and my own ability to discover the truth. But I wanted to know the truth so badly. So from there, I decided to travel to Costa Rica, and I went there for 3 months, and I worked on a farm in very rural Costa Rica. And there was a former Peace Corps volunteers who had kind of created this little Western haven of, we would make composting toilets, and there were yoga classes and all these different things, but I was kind of a volunteer on the farm, so I would carry wood, and I would bake things in a solar oven, and I was having a blast. But at the same time, I was kind of in this little conclave of people who thought like me, and didn't believe in God, of course, and all these kind of things. But surrounding us were these, salt of the earth, really faithful, poor Catholics.
Indigenous people.
Some of them were, and some of them were just, native Costa Ricans. And I was living with a family at the time, and they were in such a rural area that they couldn't have Mass except for bi-weekly on a Thursday. And in the middle of that, the mother of the family that I was living with would go to the church and clean it. She would sweep it every single day and clean it. And I just remember observing her faithfulness to that duty every single day. She never talked to me about God. No one ever really talked to me very much about God, but I felt their faith.
Well, you were there for 3 months, so you're starting to capture this in the feeling of it. Do you remember a moment, was it during there or once you got back, that a light shined in the midst of your darkness?
Yeah, there were a few things that kind of started to move me. One of them was the village drunk came up to me, and he just, he would just kind of banter with me every once in a while. He said, "Oh, Teresita," he's like, "isn't it a beautiful, gorgeous day?" And I said, "Oh, Chepo, it's a gorgeous day." He's like, "Thank God for this day. Don't you thank God for this day?" And I said, "I don't really, because I don't believe in God." And he looked at me with mirth, just kind of amused and bewildered. and he just looked straight into my eyes. And I remember feeling like I was seeing someone who knew something that I didn't know and who was wiser than me. And it was the village drunk, and I was very kind of astonished by that. He was making, a farmer's kind of metaphysical argument. Very simple, but kind of, oh, really? You think this all is here? Just here? Okay. And then he walked away. But that was one moment that led to my conversion moment.
He was just quoting St. Paul in Romans 1 about the evidence of God is right.
Or, causal arguments for the existence of God or anything. Yeah.
All right. So you have that experience with him,
and so my conversion happened in a moment. It really was. I think it was God in His compassion for me and my struggles, seeing me just flailing. Morally, flailing intellectually, and just wanting to rescue me. And so it was a moment of great grace that it was very early in the morning. I was walking to the farm, and I was walking over a hill, and I looked around me, and Costa Rica is so beautiful. It was mountains and tropical forests. And I said to myself, this is so beautiful. And I felt gratitude for the beauty. And at the same time that I felt that gratitude, there was a huge gust of wind that was so forceful that I felt like a tree was going to fall on me. And I remember thinking, a tree's going to fall on me. And it was almost like I felt this mixture of gratitude and fear and awe, and knowing that my gratitude had an object. And in that moment, God introduced Himself to me, just made his presence so felt that I knew that God existed, that He loved me, and that He had a plan for my life.
Well, would you say then, in summary, although I got more time that virtue of gratitude, which we take for granted, is really the key thing that sets us apart, even from animals, but from atheists, that it's that key of what gratitude is.
Yeah.
It really is it's the turning point.
Yeah. It really was for me. I think humility prepared the way for that, and some atheists really modeled that for me, humility and love for learning and love for the truth. But it was that moment of gratitude and realizing that gratitude had an object and that everything around me had a creator.
Yeah. As I made that reference to that Romans passage, which I really want to point to it, because he says in Romans 1, it's the way he begins this whole argument. He begins this whole argument that it's all right there. What can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, His invisible nature, namely His eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. It's right there.
Yeah.
But
He's
do we see
making a metaphysical argument, basically, Paul. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's that turn. That's the gratitude. And I love it that it was this simple man that just pointed it out to you.
Yeah, it really was.
Well, there you are, awakened to the reality of God in the midst of the beauty of Costa Rica, but there's a long journey from there to here.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So after I knew that God existed, I didn't automatically say, oh, Catholicism is true. In fact, I was very resistant to the idea that Catholicism was true. But I was really happy that God existed and that He loved me and that He had a plan for my life. I mean, the despair that I had been feeling just went away. I just felt so full of joy, because to have a purpose for my life and to have someone who loved me and who not just loves me like a boyfriend loves you or even a mother and a father, but who is love itself, that's a love that can heal you on a deep level and that can bring you a joy that you just really can't realize otherwise. And so I just talked to God all the time. I was on the plane on the way home and I thought, God has a plan for my life. God, do you have a plan for my life? Is it to go to law school? Is it to marry the boyfriend I'm planning on marrying? And I didn't hear an answer in that, but I was like, I don't think his plan is my plan. So I got off the plane and I broke up with my boyfriend and I decided not to go to law school just because I'm a person of 150% and I believed in God, and that was changing my life. And so I was sleeping on my friend's couch and I had no idea what I was going to do with my life, but I just felt had never felt so free. I had never felt so happy. And so I just talked to God every day. God, what do you think about this? God, what do you think about that? I would go to the store and I would look at the deodorant and be like, God, which deodorant should I pick? Well, I'm sure you don't care about that. And then I would feel him say to me, I care about everything that you do, every decision that you make, everything that you do. And so slowly over time, I felt him tugging at my heart and leading me back to the Catholic Church. And he did it through the Eucharist, because there had been a moment in my atheism when I was at Stanford. I had gone to their chapel in the middle of campus. It's a beautiful chapel, and it was during a Catholic Mass. And I walked by while it was happening, and I saw a Dominican out front, and his robes were blowing, and I just thought, that person, it just is like so heavenly. There's something like attractive about that. He looks so peaceful. And I walked inside and I remember sitting there thinking, someone's looking at me. And it's not the people around me, like someone is looking at me. And I realized after my conversion that someone was Jesus in the tabernacle, and that Jesus was present in the Eucharist. And if God is present in the Eucharist, then I have to become Catholic. And I thought, wow, I have so many intellectual obstacles to that. So many things I don't believe, so many things I just don't understand and really, really reject on a deep level. But God led me in that direction. And I had trust that he was going to work out those difficulties. I no longer had the faith in my intellectual ability to figure everything out. I really knew that his authority was going to clear my mind and aid my reason.
I think you know, but behind you is a special painting, right? You don't need to turn around, but it's Rembrandt's wonderful picture.
Yeah.
When did that moment happen? When you let your parents know that your faith was back?
I told them pretty soon after that I believed in God. I waited a little while to tell them about the Catholicism aspect of it, because I wanted to be totally sure maybe this was just a stepping stone and I was going to go to something else, but eventually I did tell them. And pretty soon after I got to the church, God started kind of nudging me in the direction of religious life.
Right. Yes, the next. Right?
Yeah. And that was not something I was interested in, and not something that I really wanted to do at all. So I really fought against that. I really wrestled with God, and I really wrestled in discernment even after joining the convent. But that fundamental relationship that I had with God, and that relationship of prayer, just bringing things to him all the time and asking him, and the trust that I had in his love for me, made me realize, again, it's that intellectual thing. I trust you even though I don't understand. I trust you even though I don't comprehend. I trust you even though intellectually I really don't see how that could lead to my happiness. Poverty, chastity, obedience, really? I don't think that's going to lead me to happiness. But I no longer had the trust in my thought workings on things. I really trusted that God had created me. God was going to help me to understand how this would lead me to happiness. And I was going to do it because I trusted him, not myself.
When did you sense the call to the particular? Well, first of all, the strength in your conviction to become religious, but also your particular religious order.
I was in Northern California at the time. I was working in IT. I was really looking around at all these different orders and so many different things, so many different ways of living religious life. I was so confused. I had no idea about, what to look for or what. I just was totally naive about everything. And I really was, but I trusted that God would lead me. So at one point I was so tired of looking and not finding. I said to God, this was your idea and I don't even want to do it anyway. So you better figure this out. So I was watching a YouTube video of Father Stan Fortuna, who's a CFR, and I was a really big fan of his. I would go to all of his talks in the Bay Area. And I was watching that video, and he picked up one of JP2's encyclicals, John Paul II, and he said, "This is for my girls at the Daughters of St. Paul," because we print encyclicals, all the encyclicals. I thought, oh, I don't know who they are. So I started to investigate them. Even though I worked in IT, I wasn't particularly attracted to working with our charism is using modern media to spread the gospel. So I wasn't particularly attracted to that, but I was attracted to the idea of evangelization and helping people to find the joy that I have found. So I again, joining the Daughters of St. Paul was all these things kind of fighting against it and really not understanding on a human level why this would be the best place for me, but knowing that God was guiding me there and trusting that God was going to lead me to happiness. And really, I would say that my comfort with becoming a religious is fairly recent, even though I've been in a convent for several years now. It was really on meditating on my death that helped me to realize that I wanted to do this. I wanted to dedicate my life to this, and I wanted to die for Jesus.
We've got a couple minutes left. Talk about that specifically, your meditation on death and how that was an important part of your journey.
Yeah, our founder, it was a very important part of his journey, and he was kicked out of the seminary at one point. We're not totally sure why that happened, but we think it was because he was reading too much of things that he wasn't necessarily supposed to read. And but when he came back, I believe that it was through meditation on death and the last things that helped him to kind of realize how he needed to change. And that became a really fundamental to his spirituality. And he kept a skull on his desk, and he meditated on his death every day. So a few years ago, I just decided to do the same 2 years ago. And so I put a skull on my desk, and I started to meditate on my death every day. And we spread the gospel through modern media, so I thought I'll tweet this. So on Twitter, I just decided to tweet my random thoughts about meditating on my death. And I thought I would do it for 2 weeks, but I ended up doing it for over 500 days, tweeting it. Yeah. Now, I've been meditating on my death every day since then. And it's totally, I call it a conversion within a conversion, because it has really helped me to live completely for God, to make all of my decisions around God, because I have no idea how much time I have. I have no idea when I'm going to die. So today I want to live for holiness, because I could die on my car ride to the airport today.
Yeah. Well, I am a firm believer that all of the New Testament authors, as well as our Lord, talk about life in obedience to Jesus we're always in waiting. Well, like the women waiting for the wedding. Are they ready? Are they ready? Are they ready? And that's what every day is to be like, right?
Yeah.
And that's what you're talking about. It may be by completely be awakened to the fact that death can happen anytime, helps us be ready.
Exactly, because I would read those passages, and I'd read "Stay vigilant," and I would think, how? I really want to, but how do you keep up that fervor constantly? And for me, meditation on death is what has helped me to do that, because it's kind of given an urgency to my decisions and an urgency to my life every day.
How would you help an atheist watching? What would you say to them? I know it comes by grace, but what would you say to them right now if they were listening to you?
Every person's journey is so unique. And after I joined the convent, I wrote a book called The Prodigal You Love, Inviting Loved Ones Back to the Church. And it's to help people to invite their loved ones back to the church. And so many people come to me who have children who are atheists, or who have loved ones who are atheists, and they say, "Sister, how?" And I say, well, my book is not going to give you a silver bullet answer to every person, because every person is so unique. But first of all, I think our holiness our Christian holiness is so important as an evangelization tool. So often we're focused on other people. How can we change that atheist to have him figure out how God exists, become saints? Because that's going to convince people. The saints are the most convincing evangelization tool that there can possibly be. So I think that's huge. But I think, if there's any atheists out there watching, continue to pursue the truth tenaciously, because what else could life be about besides pursuing the truth and trying to understand what is the truth? And the truth is a person.
And your story also encourages us to make sure that our lives convey gratitude.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that can be contagious.
Definitely.
Thank you, Sister Theresa. Thank you for sharing your journey. And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I pray that Sister's story is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.